seeing Cardinal George last night made me remember the time he was in my office, and he was still not a cardinal, but this was many years ago, and he was concerned about the large number of epistemological nihilists among the priests and seminarians at that time. So you can be relieved that I'm not one of them. Nevertheless, I'm not an economist, and I'm a systematic theologian, not even an ethicist or moral theologian. And so Bishop Blair will perhaps remember the wise words of our old teacher of Spanish, the Vincentian Charles Barr, who told me the most unforgettable advice maybe I've ever had. Confidence is that feeling you have before you really understand the situation. So, since the early 70s, I've been involved in the founding and implementation of an interdisciplinary alternative to Boston College's core program, the Perspectives program it's called, and I have concentrated on one of the components, Horizons in the New Social Sciences, which studies classics in political science, law, sociology, and economics. And in this course, my law school colleague, Tom Kohler, has collaborated with me, and he has been teaching that same course at the law school, which Mary Ann Glendon named The Foundations of Western Law when she was still at Boston College. The person about whose ideas I wrote a 26-page, 11,000-word paper for this conference is the philosopher and author of Insight, A Study in Human Understanding, and theologian, author of Method in Theology, Bernard Lonergan, whose works on grace, the Trinity, and Christology are now included in the University of Toronto's collected works, now numbering over 20 volumes. When he came as a septuagenarian to teach at Boston College from 1976 to 1983, he resumed his work on his theory of monetary circulation and production, which he'd worked on in his spare time during the 14 years from 1930 till 1944. He taught a course on macroeconomic dynamics, which I attended a few times, and after Lonergan's death, with BC colleagues Patrick Byrne in philosophy and Charles Heffling in theology, I edited a 1944 manuscript that was the basis for the course in order to make revisions of that text available in volume 15 of the collected works. Although I possess no expertise in economics, as a lay Catholic theologian, I have tried to reflect on our present social and cultural malaise from the standpoint of both Lonergan's philosophy and theology, and what I think I've understood about his work in economics. My paper tried to place the Catholic social justice principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and responsibility in the context of an ecological approach to political economy, whereby ecology is meant an interrelated and interconnected set of schemes of recurrence, which have their probabilities of emergence and survival, so that series of ecologies can form chains of sequential dependence, with prior ecologies grounding the probability of the emergence of the next. So this fits in with what Lonergan considers to be the most general intelligibility of the created universe, which is a generalized probability. Lonergan conceived the relevant ecologies or sets of recurrent schemes in terms of a central aspect of his account of the human good, which is the concrete outcome of human acts of knowledge and decision. He named this dimension of the human good the good of order, in order to distinguish it both from particular goods as the objectives of human needs and desires, and values, which he articulated as a normative scale, including vital, social, cultural, personal, and religious values. The good of order is the objective arrangement of institutions that ensures for a group of people the regular recurrence of particular goods. They could be material goods, but also spiritual goods, as John O'Donovan brought out. As appetite wants breakfast, so an economic system is to ensure breakfast every morning. As appetite wants knowledge, so an educational system answers the imparting of knowledge to each successive generation. As specifically economic, the good of order becomes most obvious, perhaps, when it breaks down. As Lonergan wrote decades ago, there can be a depression, and it is not for a lack of raw materials, nor for lack of factories and railways, nor for lack of capital. Money is going begging. Nor is it for lack of people willing to work, or for lack of people willing to invest. It is just that the whole setup has simply gone awry. It just will not work. That is a case of evil in the depression. You can see the absence of the good of order. To illustrate the ecology based on different aspects of the good of order, I used an analysis of the relationships among politics, economy, and society by Nicholas Boyle. Besides being a celebrated biographer of Goethe, Boyle is the general editor of the 4 volumes just published by Cambridge University Press of The Impact of Idealism, which details the impact of the German philosophic tradition upon many fields, including political economy. Lonergan was challenged to think deeply about the economic good of order by what he characterized in a book review as the materialist trinity of 18th century capitalism, 19th century communism, and 20th century Nazism. Communism, he wrote, is a collective reaction against capitalist individualism. Nazism is a nationalist reaction against the international character of finance and world revolution. Despite their differences and oppositions, all 3 agree in the dedication of man, soul and body, to the goods of this world. None of them acknowledges and submits to a higher end or higher law for man. Their consequences are not a matter of abstract deduction. The experiment has been performed and is still being performed on the quivering body of humanity. The results are not pleasant. Lonergan was a champion of democracy and of advanced industrial economy based on free enterprise and exchange. He was convinced that the democratic form of government depended on whether a critical mass of citizens would be able to understand and operate morally within the free enterprise system. My paper underscores what a key to his analysis, a correct understanding of freedom. As a matter of fact, neither the liberal democracy founded upon possessive individualism by Hobbes, Locke, and Adam Smith, nor the social democracy grounded on the philosophies of Rousseau and Marx possess such an understanding. For the former, freedom came down to doing as you please, and for the latter, liberty became a function of what Shlomo Avineri named social totalitarianism. Both liberal capitalism and liberal socialism are each rooted in Machiavellian verità effettuale, and so are concerned not with the ends of freedom, from which they strategically prescind, but with the conditions of liberty, life, liberty, and estate, to use Locke's formulation. The overriding issue became, as Alan Bloom put it, what's the use of being good when you're not well off? The first aspect of my thesis, therefore, regards the impossibility of making the principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and responsibility, taking them seriously, when your thinking is confined to either truncated or utopian conceptions of freedom. In this regard, I referred to Pierre Monod's analysis of the intimate link between the rise of commercial society and the ambiguity in accord with which the way modern liberty oscillates between ends and means, quote, largely accounts for modern commercial society's prodigious dynamism. Excuse me, could I have a glass of water? Thank you. Thanks so much. Lonergan always stressed that human liberty, correctly understood, has to be motivated by correct understanding of the human situation requiring action. And it has to be guided by a normative scale of values. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, the two conditions for authentic freedom, two of the conditions that are not all, are that there exist a number of courses of actions that are objectively possible, and second, that people individually or collectively have an awareness and correct understanding of such objective possibilities. Today, understanding objective possibilities evokes an urgent need to understand correctly the distinct functions constitutive of both the economic good of order and the political good of order. For an example of this urgency, John Cassidy's recent summary in The New Yorker of French economist Thomas Piketty's book on capital in the 21st century, entitled Capital and the Origins of Growth, sort of alluding to both Marx on the one hand and Origins of Wealth, I should have said, and Adam Smith on the other. Piketty claims that the extreme income inequality that has held sway since 1973 has been driven not by specifically economic factors, as some economists have tended to allege, but by political policies. Now, Lonergan held that the role of politics, as classically defined, is to judge, guide, and direct the economy, which encompasses all the activities engaged in transforming the potentialities given by nature into the goods and services that make up the standard of living, in light of the common good of society. But he insisted that politics can do this authentically only on the basis of a correct understanding of the economic good of order. Similarly, economy's role is to order technology, what Marx termed the forces of production, in relation to producing a sustainable and humane standard of living. While we all might agree that our unhealthy and potentially disastrous mix-up of politics and economics is rooted in sin, the massive possessiveness and pleonexia to which Mary Hirschfeld's ladder tends to lead, Lonergan believed that it also has to do with a basic misunderstanding of economic dynamics. With the coincidental appearance in 1929 of the Depression and of Pius XI's Quadragesimo Anno, when he was a student at Heathrow College in England, Lonergan realized that Catholics concerned with social justice had to understand, quote, the dynamic of events unfolding rhythmically among production, exchange, and finance in capitalist exchange economies. So Lonergan set out to discover the significant variables that would express in a single unified view the economic good of order, because the Depression demonstrated ad oculos that, as he wrote during the Depression years, quote, "The liberal dream of an automatic economy has, like all dreams, at long last broken. The necessity of rational control has ceased to be a question, and the one issue is the locus of that control. Is it to be absolutist, from above downwards? Is it to be democratic, from below upwards? Plainly, it can be democratic only in the measure in which economic science succeeds in uttering not counsel to rulers, but precepts to mankind, not specific remedies and plans to increase the power of bureaucracies, but universal laws which men themselves administrate in the personal conduct of their lives. To deny the possibility of a new science of economics and new precepts is, I am convinced, to deny the possibility of the survival of democracy." In my paper, I did no more than briefly sketch Lonergan's views on the relationships within society among, first, the capitalist or producer goods expansion, and second, the materialist or consumer goods expansions of the economy, and third, the enlargement of material conditions for the institutions of culture in the broadest sense. In Lonergan's functional analysis of the producer goods expansions and contractions in relation to the consumer goods expansions and contractions, if accelerations and decelerations of money flows occur in accord with the norms of what he called the pure cycle of economic growth, in which major innovations ramify into a vast production of new plants and equipment, and the resultant elevation of the standard of living, then the dynamisms of the macroeconomy do not have to be characterized solely in terms of the booms and slumps conventionally associated with business or trade cycles. Instead, they can level off at a higher standard of living until human inventiveness and creativity call forth a new capital expansion. Because of present, that is, post the 2007-8 collapse of the housing market and the banking crisis, I belabored Lonergan's ideas about the importance of correctly understanding 2 points. First, the nature and function of money as a technique for accounting rather than an object to be accumulated. And second, his insight into the fact that while constant and normal profit is a legitimate incentive for entrepreneurial activity, in itself, profit is not an adequate criterion or standard for assessing the intelligent, reasonable, and responsible functioning of the economy. So this harmonizes very beautifully with Joan O'Donovan's presentation of the Franciscan economists. Here again, the central issue is the all-important link between correct understanding and human freedom, because the widespread misunderstanding of money and profit affects banking, savings, and investment, which only makes sense, proper sense, as essentially redistributive functions that coordinate the flows of money with the intelligible demands set by the cycles of production and exchange. And of course, this would be indispensable for grasping the significance of interest rates, taxation where polity and economy intersect. I tried to show how misunderstandings of money and profit are directly related to the currently disordered state of finance. Not only did the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act open the way for technological innovations such as the algorithmic hedging of bets and the virtual instantaneity of trading in the sphere of investment banking, but it also made it possible to expand the responsible function of futures trading into irresponsible techniques of securitization, which has led to the rampant corruption of banks, crediting agencies, and trading practices such as short selling and the manipulation of the subprime mortgage markets. The short-sightedness of both supply-side and demand-side economic ideas serve only to allow the partial correctness and the partial erroneousness of either approach to affect policies in such a way that the intelligibility of the relationships among polity, economy, and technology has become so opaque that ordinary citizens, let alone economists and politicians, start to regard the notions of solidarity, subsidiarity, and responsibility as no more than vague moral imperatives that cannot be practically implemented even in the so-called free societies of the West. A further sense of disorder is the growing inability to exercise prudential judgment by any standards independent of market values, which becomes institutionally more dominant with mounting monetization of all the social roles, combined with prevailing bureaucratically rationalized institutions. These trends tend to dissolve traditional manners and mores integral to institutional frameworks of cooperation, and to eliminate personal and religious values, so that Max Weber's description of society as an iron cage becomes ever more true. From the perspective of Lonergan's approach to the Christian philosophy of history, the image of the iron cage is just one symptom of the situation of sin that constitutes the vector of deformation, which, along with the vectors of formation and of redemption, condition but do not determine the course of human history. For Lonergan, human sin is not natural, but rather a matter of moral impotence, which manifests its roots in the individual bias, of which Aristotle spoke when he said that most men know what is good, but do what is to their own advantage, and in the group bias discussed by James Madison in Federalist 10, when he showed how factions threaten the common good that he sort of reductively formulated as the permanent and aggregate interests of the people. And finally, in the short-sightedness and anti-intellectual tendencies endemic in the common sense bias, one of whose most alarming manifestations today is the accelerating threat to liberal arts education, fomented by the turn of the best and brightest towards science, technology, economics, and management, or the so-called STEM courses. In order to grasp the implications of solidarity, subsidiarity, and responsibility, we need fully to realize that human freedom and openness transcend what can be evaluated in market terms alone. The reconstruction of sound goods of order presupposes a scale of values that is normative, inasmuch as lower values set the conditions for the higher values, while the higher values are that for the sake of which the lower values exist. Thus, you do have to honor the vital values of life and health in order to foster such social values within the spheres of technology and economy that set the conditions for a just polity. But because human beings do not live by bread alone, as we were reminded this morning, social values as political must go beyond serving the economy to facilitate a civil conversation in which citizens can mediate between social meanings and values and the cultural values that set the standard for social values. A culture in which genuine liberal, in the sense of liberating education, thrives brings about the flourishing of the sciences, arts, and literature, which set the conditions for the appreciation of personal values. At the end of the day, however, religious values heighten the probabilities for personal values to be rightly apprehended and lived. Bishop Marcello reminded us that as Christians, we believe in the social nature of grace as created participation in the life of the triune God. Accordingly, God is love, and God's love is given by the Holy Spirit, poured out into our hearts. God's love is declared and affirmed in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and God's love is consummated in the beatific vision, in which our knowledge of God the Father becomes more like God's knowledge of us. It follows that if the deforming vector of sin is rooted in bias, Christian faith in revelation goes against the cultural tendency to consider the truth about the most important things unattainable, and this amounts to a healing of mind. Religious hope counters the tendency to despair in the face of the endless cycles of power and weakness, and this heals the human spirit. And because of the imitation and love of and union with Jesus, Christian religious love transforms the egoism that leads us to put our own interests and advantage above all others, and this is a healing of the heart. The Catholic Church teaches that because of the historical life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the Holy Spirit is offered to all people, and this corresponds to St. Thomas Aquinas' treatment of the whole Christ in Summa Theologiae, third part, second question, Article 8. For Lonergan, therefore, the healing brought about by God's grace is indispensable for human creativity, that the reconstruction of the social, economic, and political orders requires. The ultimate basis for the implementation of the ecological recurrence schemes that realize the ideals of human solidarity, subsidiarity, and responsibility is cooperating with God's outgoing love. Thank you.